Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system and specifically the heart. Now with the heart, you see the structure to the left-hand side. That's going to be a replica or a model. And the things that we're going to discuss with the heart are going to be structures of the heart. We're going to talk about the paths of circulation, so blood that flows through the heart and then blood that flows around the body, as well as blood that flows around the heart and feeds actual muscular tissue. We're going to talk about the heart physiology or the structures of the heart along with the heart, that's the heart anatomy, but along with the electrical currents and how the heart works and pumps. We're going to discuss those blood vessels that are going to flow to and from the heart. We'll discuss blood pressure and the major arteries and veins with this cardiovascular unit. So it will be broken up into different parts. Now looking here at this picture, you're going to see the heart is going to be found in the center of the chest, which is referred to as mediastinum. It's going to be behind the sternum, and it will be found between the two lungs. Looking here at this picture, you can see how the top of the aorta, that's going to be the largest artery in the body, is going to come right there around the top of the sternum, and that section specifically referred to as the manubrium. If you come down, you'll see that right under the second but above the third rib on each side is where you're going to find the actual top of the heart. Now the top of the heart is going to consist of two atrium, and then you have two ventricles, which are going to be the bottom sections of the heart, which we'll talk about. So looking at this picture, you can also see, even though it's located on the center section of the chest, it is actually pointed towards the left-hand side. So that's why they often listen to your heart with a stethoscope on the left-hand side. Now with that, the tip of the heart on the left-hand side is going to be referred to as the apex. So that's the pointy section or the curve of the heart. The top portion of the heart is referred to as the base, and that's where you're going to see all of the vessels coming out. So you see things such as the superior vena cava on the top. You'll also see that aorta that's going around the top, and you'll see the pulmonary trunk coming out with the pulmonary arteries. Now they took away the sternum and the ribs, and you can look at it and see how it's situated between the two lungs. Notice that you do see those vessels coming out the top again. You have a really good view of the two atria. Mainly the right atria is really showing there. And then you see the ventricles. You also see the vessels that are going through the heart on the top portion of the heart that are surrounded by the adipose tissue. Now, this one also shows you the base of the heart. That's going to be the section where you have all the vessels coming out the top, and the apex of the heart, which is going to be the pointy tip section, which is pointed to the left-hand side. Now, notice when you're looking at the bottom section where the apex is, you see a muscular sectioning that's going to separate the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. That muscular structure is going to be referred to as the diaphragm. Now with that diaphragm, if you look closely at the bottom of the heart, you'll see how there is fibrous connective tissue that is connecting the heart there to that section where that diaphragm is. And so here you're looking at just simply another visual or another diagram that shows the heart being located through the center or mediastinum. And you see that aortic arch along with the pulmonary trunk. You see the superior vena cava in this picture. You also see that muscular diaphragm going across, and you see how it's kind of connected at that section. Now remember, with anatomy, everything's going to be found flipped because it says if the person is turned and they're facing you now. So what's on your right-hand side, like the apex of the heart that's pointing to the right, is actually on that person's left-hand side. So with the structure of the heart, first we're going to discuss the coverings. So the heart's going to be found in the thoracic cavity, and it's going to be surrounded by three membranes called the pericardium. The outer membrane is going to be called the fibrous pericardium. It's going to form a sac that goes around the heart, and it's going to help to anchor that heart to the diaphragm, which is what I was showing you in the previous pictures, to the sternum, to the vertebral column, and to the large blood vessels that are going to be coming out of the heart. Now, the middle membrane that's going to be found covering the heart is going to be referred to as the parietal pericardium. That's going to be continuous with the inner membrane. It's that inner membrane, okay, is actually going to be the section that goes around the heart, and that's going to be referred to as the visceral pericardium. So with these different types of membranes, which you probably learned in Anatomy 141, the parietal membrane is going to be towards the wall or towards the outer section of the body. The visceral is going to be towards that actual organ that it's surrounding or covering. And so here we have the visceral pericardium, which is often referred to as the epicardium. So looking at this picture, you can see the actual heart muscle that's going to be there. That's the myocardium. The endocardium is going to be kind of a smooth, slick-like structure, which is going to be the inner portion of the heart. The outer section of the heart is going to be referred to as the epicardium, and that's where the visceral pericardium is going to come together or is attached at. Now with that, you have a pericardial cavity. Within that pericardial cavity, you'll find the pericardial fluid, and that's there to help reduce friction. So the pericardial cavity is going to be found between the visceral and parietal pericardium, and that fluid, like I just said, is going to reduce that friction there as the heart beats. Now, to think of these cavities as a balloon filled with air kind of helps. So we have the heart, and you're going to push that heart into the balloon. As you push it into the balloon, it's going to surround the heart with the balloon, and the air that's actually inside is going to be that open space. Now within that open space is where you're going to find that pericardial fluid. The section of that balloon that comes in contact or touches the heart is going to be that visceral pericardium. The section that's going to be the outer portion that goes towards the walls or the outside of the heart is going to be referred to as the parietal pericardium. And so here we're looking at the structure of the heart again, and this is showing you what that pericardium looks like that's going around the heart. It's simply a very, very thin sac that surrounds and protects the heart. So if you were to do any type of dissection, especially if you dissected a pig and you were to go in, you would see this that surrounds the heart as you go into the pig, and then you can cut it slightly and remove it to open it up so you can actually see the other structures of the heart. Sometimes in labs, like in a lab if we were doing this not online but in class, when you go in and you cut that heart open, sometimes you can actually order them that have the pericardium that goes around the heart, so you can actually remove it then. Most of them, though, they do send with the pericardium already removed. But looking here at this pericardium, notice it's very thin. You can almost see through it, and it almost has like a cellophane type structure to me. That's what I think of when I see it's very thin, very see-through, and can rip and tear easily. Okay, so looking at this, you see that aorta coming up and out of the heart. You see the pulmonary trunk, which is coming up and out. You see the superior vena cava, which is actually going into that right atrium. You see the right auricle. That's going to be the section right there below. You see the right atrium. That's where blood's going to come in from around the body or the upper portions of the body. The right ventricle is going to be below that. The pericardial cavity shows kind of an opening towards the bottom. If you want to go over to the right-hand side, you see that pulmonary trunk that we discussed, the left auricle, which is going to be part of the atrium. You see that fibrous pericardium on the outer edge, and then the cut edge of the parietal pericardium is going to be towards the inner portion of that. And then you're going to actually see the visceral pericardium that's actually covering the heart there. This that you see here is an actual picture of a fresh specimen or one that was preserved well. When you take the heart out and it's fresh, it's going to have a nice red and pink tint to it, just like any type of meat that you would buy at the grocery store. If it's been preserved or if it has been dead for some time, then that meat or that heart actually starts to turn brown. So it would have a more brown look. So when we dissect these in actual lab, they do have kind of a brown tinge to them, and they're not usually nice and red or pink like this. Okay, so looking at it, you see that aortic arch at the top, and of course it is covered in some fat, has some fat there. You see the pulmonary trunk, the auricle of the right atrium, you see the auricle of the left atrium, and then you see that anterior interventricular artery, which is how you orient yourself in lab when you're looking at it to find the front. So you look for that interventricular artery that goes down the center, and it does have some adipose tissue or fat that runs along with it. And then, of course, you see your right ventricle and your left ventricle, which has the apex. Second thing we're going to talk about is going to be the wall of the heart. It's going to be composed of three major layers. It has the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. The epicardium is going to be that outer covering. It's going to surround the outer section of the heart, and that's where we also see the visceral pericardium that goes around the heart. The myocardium, myo means muscle, so this is going to be the muscular portion of the heart. This is where we're going to find that cardiac muscle tissue, and it's also going to consist of blood vessels also that are going to be running throughout it to feed that muscle. And then you have your endocardium. This is going to be the inner protective layer, and like I said, it often looks kind of slick or kind of very smooth and shiny when you actually do a heart dissection. Heart chambers and heart valves. With the heart, it's basically going to be a muscular pump. That pump's going to be responsible for pumping blood throughout the entire body and making sure that blood makes its way back to the heart in order to pick up oxygen and pump it through the body again. So within that heart, it consists of 4 chambers. You're going to have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. So with that, each one of those is going to have valves between it. And so going from the atria to the ventricle, you'll find a valve. Going from the ventricle out, you're going to find another valve. And then coming back in, going from the left atria to the ventricle, you're going to have a valve. And then leaving out through the aorta, you'll have a valve. And we'll look at that in just a minute when we look at the pictures. And so, the 2 upper chambers are going to be called the right and left atria. They can receive blood from the body and from the lungs. So if it's coming in to the right atria, it's receiving blood from the body. If it's coming into the left atria, it's receiving blood from the lungs. The lower chambers of the heart are going to be referred to as the ventricles, and you'll have a right and left ventricle. And so the ventricles are going to be separated in the center by a muscular divide called the septum. And so that's called an interventricular septum. And so it simply separates the 2 ventricles. So here we see a frontal section or a frontal cut. That's where you cut down through the center of the body and you open it up and you have a front and back half. And so with this, we're able to see directly into the heart diagram. Just a moment. Right, so we're going to start off with the superior vena cava. Not doing so good drawing. Okay, so this is going to be this vessel that's coming in. That superior vena cava is going to be responsible for bringing deoxygenated blood to the heart from the head and the upper limbs. Next, you have your right pulmonary artery. That's going to be this right here. That's taking the deoxygenated blood that was pumped from the heart into the lungs. So I know it's an artery, but arteries don't always carry oxygenated blood like you might think they do. In the pulmonary system, it will carry deoxygenated blood. Next, you have the pulmonary trunk, which is going to be this section here. It kind of goes up like a T and then splits off. It's going to have the right pulmonary artery going to the right lung. The left pulmonary artery is going to go to the left lung. Coming down, then you have your right atrium, which is going to be this muscular structure here. Notice how the muscle is not really thick. It's going to be a very thin muscle because it only needs to pump blood from the atrium to the ventricle, which is going to be the next chamber that you see down below here. So that's going to be your right ventricle. Now, in between these, or inside, let's look, we have what's referred to as the fossa ovalis. That actually is going to be a hole that's going to be found in a fetus heart or a fetal heart. It does close up before the baby's born. You have pectinate muscles. These are going to be the muscles that are going to make up the atrium. They are going to be a very thin muscle. If you see that there, it's not nearly as thick because, like again, we said that it only needs to pump from the atrium down to the ventricle, which is not very far. The tricuspid valve is going to be the valve that's going to shut off once that blood is pushed out of the atrium into the left ventricle. It is important that it closes up so none of that blood backflows or flows back into the atrium, and that way it keeps the heart very efficient as long as there's not backflow. Now the tricuspid valve gets its name because it's going to have 3 cusps or 3 parts that come off of it. Each one of those is going to be connected to what's referred to as a papillary muscle that you will see here. And so that each little piece is going to be a papillary muscle. The parts that you see attached to it are actually tendons, and those are going to be referred to as chordae tendineae. And so those tendineae, once they pull or are pulled by the papillary muscle and close up that valve, it's going to keep blood from flowing backwards from the ventricle into that atrium. Now looking inside of the right ventricle here, you're going to see these different indentions. Those are called trabeculae carneae, and that's going to be the different sections or the trabeculae that you're going to find within the heart, kind of like the trabeculae that you'd find in a bone, except for this one's going to be made up of muscle. And the last thing that you're going to see at the bottom is going to be the inferior vena cava, and that's bringing deoxygenated blood from the trunk of the body and the lower extremities into the right atrium. And so you see that inferior vena cava is going to bring blood into the atrium through this section, and you see this opening up here, which is going to bring the superior vena cava's blood in. And so that's going to be the right-hand side of the heart. So here's what happened. Blood's going to enter in from that superior and inferior vena cava, comes into the right atrium. The right atrium is going to contract, push the blood through the tricuspid valve, and then into the right ventricle. From that right ventricle, once it contracts, and notice how that right ventricle, the myocardium, is not going to be very thick at all going through this section. It's going to contract, and that muscle is going to push blood through the pulmonary valve, which is going to be found here, up through this pulmonary trunk, and then it's going to split and go either to the right pulmonary artery or through the left pulmonary artery, and that will take it either to the right or to the left lung. It's going to drop off its deoxygenated blood at that point, and it's going to pick up oxygen. So oxygen is then going to come back to the left atrium, and so it comes back through pulmonary veins. And so here, we see the left pulmonary veins. Over here, you're going to see the right pulmonary veins, and what they do is they're going to come from behind the heart, and your right pulmonary veins are going to enter through little holes this section, and then you can see on this portion of the atrium where the left pulmonary veins are going to enter. So this blood is now just left the lungs and is fully oxygenated and coming back to the heart. It dumps it back into that left atrium. The left atrium is going to contract. It's going to go through what's known as the bicuspid valve because it has 2 flaps or 2 parts to it. Those are attached, remember, to these papillary muscles that you'll see here. And they're attached using these strings, which are referred to as chordae tendineae. And so when they pull on those chordae tendineae, it causes it to shut that valve off. The blood has entered into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, notice how much thicker that muscular wall is. So this myocardium is going to be extremely thick on the left-hand side compared to the right-hand side. The reason for that is that the muscle has to be able to pump all of the blood that's in that left atrium to the entire body and then get it back to the heart. So this is the last time it's going to be pumped before it makes its way back to the heart through either the superior or inferior vena cava. And so it's going to pump that blood. When it pumps it, it then is going to exit through this aortic valve and come up through the aorta. When it comes up through the aorta, it'll come up through the aortic arch, and it can split off. The vessels that you see on top here are going to go up through the neck and through the arms. What doesn't go that way can go and dive deep behind the heart. You don't see it because it's behind that muscle, but you see it down further. And as it goes down, that's called the descending aorta. Now, as it goes down to feed the trunk and the lower portions of the body, the lower extremities, it might take a different specific name depending on what part of the body it's found in. So all of it's called the descending aorta, but if it's found in the upper thoracic cavity, it could be called the thoracic aorta. If it's found in the abdominal cavity, it could be referred to as the abdominal aorta. But both of those are going to be part of that descending aorta. So valves are going to be very important. Like we said, they're going to open to allow blood to flow, and then they shut to keep blood from flowing backwards. So they allow for one-way flow of blood through the heart. The tricuspid valve is referred to as an AV valve. AV stands for atrioventricular. So this atrioventricular valve helps to separate the right atrium from the right ventricle. And so that type of valve, it's going to be nice and tough, but it's not going to be nearly as tough as the semilunar valves. The mitral valve is going to be another AV valve, and this is going to be the one that separates the two chambers, the left atrium and the left ventricle. It also is referred to as the bicuspid valve. So this one could have two names, or it might be called both, depending on what text or what book you're using or what chart you're looking at. Just know that the mitral valve and the bicuspid valve are the same thing, and that's an AV valve as well. It's going to be tough, but not extremely tough. Pulmonary valve and the aortic valve are going to be referred to as semilunar valves, because when you look down on them, they have kind of a crescent moon shape or a lunar moon shape. And so with these are going to be a lot tougher. These are under pressure because they're going from the ventricles to other parts. And so with the pulmonary valve, it's going from the right ventricle to the lungs. And so it's going to be under pressure as it opens up and shuts behind it to keep blood from flowing backwards back into that right ventricle. The aortic valve is going to be the second semilunar valve, and it's going to be the toughest of the two. And so with this, even though semilunars are tougher than AV, this one's going to be extremely tough because the aorta is going to be the largest vessel, and because the left ventricle pumps with such great force, it's going to have to be able to shut off any backflow that might be trying to go backwards once it relaxes. And so this is your second semilunar valve. So looking at it from below, notice how you have your myocardium or your muscle. You have the mitral valve. That's going to be the left atrioventricular valve. You have that tricuspid valve over to the side. So notice that the mitral or bicuspid does have two sections to it. The tricuspid has three. Then looking down at the aortic and pulmonary valve, notice how these do have those kind of semicircular looks, so they're going to be semilunar valves. And those are going to be tougher than the AV valves. Now this is looking inside of the heart. When you look inside of the heart, you're going to be able to see with this picture that the papillary muscle is going to be attached to that chordae tendineae, and then the chordae tendineae is actually attached to the valve. And here's another look at valves. And so we have a semilunar cusp of the aortic valve, if you want to look at the picture at the lower left-hand corner. And then if you look above, you can see the bicuspid valve and how it kind of compares. And so you have your bicuspid valve open. And then if you look at picture B, you have the bicuspid valve closed. And that's going to cause that blood flow. Once it comes up and tries to go back in, it's going to cause it to wrap back around and come back down. Okay. And so here is another view, and this is showing you what happens when one set of valves opens, the other set closes. And so here we're going to show that the pulmonary valve and the aortic valves are going to be closed. So your semilunar valves are closed, but the atrioventricular valves are open. Then, when the AV valves close, the semilunar valves open. And here's another picture. They took and did a cut through the heart and allowed you to see in. So they have the opening for that inferior vena cava coming in. It's a large opening that's going to come into that right atrium. You see that tricuspid valve. You see the myocardium of that right ventricle. Notice how it's not nearly as thick as the myocardium of the left ventricle. Notice that those ventricles are going to be separated with a septum, and it's referred to as the interventricular septum. Notice the extreme thickness on the left ventricle. Remember, that has to pump blood to the entire body, and that's the last time it's going to be pumped under pressure before it makes its way back to the heart. And you can see the chordae tendineae and that mitral valve, or remember, it could be called the bicuspid valve. Now, inside the heart, it does have what's referred to as its own skeleton or fibrous ring that you'll see there. And so it's going to be a membranous section and very tough, very fibrous in order to keep those chambers open. With that cardiac skeleton, its job also is going to be to serve as attachment points for cardiac muscle, and is going to help insulate so those electrical signals can be isolated to certain sections of the heart. Remember, it's going to be able to send those signals through specific junctions referred to as gap junctions. And those are going to be found in between those intercalated discs. Here you can see how the muscle of the heart is considered to be in a figure 8 shape. So making up the atrium, you see the first figure 8 shape, and then making up the ventricles, you will see the second figure 8 shape. Okay, here looking at this picture, you're going to see what it looks like if you were to do a heart dissection and go into the top part of the heart, which is going to be the atrium. This pectinate muscle that you see here is going to be smooth but rigid as well. This is going to help to increase the power of the contractions. The bottom picture is going to show you what it looks like if you were to cut into the ventricle during dissection. And in this, you're going to see all these notches and ridges, and that's referred to as the trabeculae carneae. These are going to be the muscles of that inner chamber of those ventricles, and this is going to help to pull on the chordae tendineae. Now here, this is where they have taken and done a transverse cut across the ventricles. Doing this transverse cut, you can see that the right ventricle is going to be a lot thinner than the left ventricle. Remember, with that right ventricle, it is going to pump the blood simply to the lungs, and so it just needs to make it to the lungs and then back to the heart. The left ventricle, however, is going to be much, much thicker, and the reason for that is because that left ventricle is going to have to be able to pump the blood to the entirety of the body. So it's going to pump it to the head, to the arms, to the trunk of the body, and to the legs. Okay, so looking here, you can see when it's dilated and not contracting, you can see the space is going to be open inside the right ventricle versus the left ventricle. And if you look over to the contracted, you can see how much it's actually going to be tensed up and how small that space gets. And that's going to be very important in order to push that blood out of the ventricles and into either going towards the lungs or going towards the rest of the body. And so here is where we're going to stop, and I'll pick back up with our next video. We'll go over paths of circulation, and then we'll discuss the actual physiology of the heart.